Imagine living in Australia in the 1940s, a country far from the great fashion capitals, yet deeply affected by the war. Men were being sent to the front lines, while women took over factories, hospitals, and offices. It was a time when every scrap of fabric was precious, and yet fashion still flourished, because even in times of scarcity, humans always find a way to express themselves. This is the story of how the Second World War forever changed the way Australians dressed. At the start of the decade, the world was still recovering from the Great Depression. Elegance was a distant dream, and survival was the priority. But when the war began, everything shifted. The Australian government imposed fabric rationing, forcing people to become creative. Skirts got shorter, cuts became straighter, and accessories almost disappeared. It was the birth of a practical, functional, and above all, resilient fashion. Women learned to sew, to reuse, to transform. Every dress carried a story of effort, ingenuity, and hope. Women's clothing reflected their new roles in society. They were in factories, in post offices, and serving in auxiliary military roles. The military look began to invade everyday wardrobes. Broad shoulders, defined waists, sturdy fabrics. It was a new form of femininity. Less delicate, more determined. The Australian woman of the 1940s didn't wait around. She made things happen, and her clothes showed exactly that. But, surprisingly, fashion never lost its charm, even with scarcity. Women found ways to stay elegant. A scarf in the hair, a red lipstick improvised with beetroot, a brooch passed down from their mothers. Small details, yet full of meaning. It was their way of saying, "You can take everything away, but you won't take my spirit." That sense of dignity and style amid adversity defined an entire generation. While Europe was in chaos, Australia began to look inward. Without relying so heavily on Parisian haute couture, a new identity emerged. Local seamstresses began to gain recognition. Australian labels and designers appeared almost out of necessity, creating a style that blended British elegance with a touch of tropical ease. Clothes adapted to the heat, lighter fabrics, and a sense of freedom. It was the beginning of something new. Australian fashion was starting to break free from European influence. And this is where the story becomes even more fascinating. Because what was born from scarcity ended up shaping an entire aesthetic culture. The make-do and mend mentality became part of the national identity. The Australian way of dressing gained a relaxed, practical yet sophisticated look. This mix, born out of wartime necessity, later became the foundation of modern Australian style. Casual, authentic, and full of attitude. Before we go on, if you love discovering how fashion history reveals who we really are, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now. Here, we travel through decades, countries, and revolutions that changed the way we dress and the way we think. Back to the 1940s, one of the most iconic symbols of that era was the uniform. They were everywhere on the streets, in factories, in newspapers, and they created an aesthetic of power and unity. Even Australian cinema, still in its early stages, began to portray this strong woman, upright posture, neatly styled hair, confident gaze. She represented not just resistance during wartime, but the transformation of feminine identity. When the conflict finally ended, the world breathed again and wanted to celebrate. That's when glamour returned. Australian fashion magazines began featuring Christian Dior's new look, with full skirts and cinched waists. But something had changed forever. Women now had voices, jobs, and independence. Luxury was back, but it carried a new meaning. Clothing was no longer just appearance. It had become a statement of freedom. And even today, the legacy of that decade lives on in Australian streets. In the simple cut of a summer dress, in tailored women's suits, inspired by uniforms, and in the effortless confidence of everyday wear. All of it comes from the strength of the women of the 1940s, who turned restriction into creativity and fear into style. Fashion, in truth, is a mirror of what we live through. And the 1940s in Australia proved that even in the hardest times, beauty can bloom. All it takes is courage. So, if you've made it this far, it's because you love stories that go beyond clothes. Leave a like and comment which decade of Australian fashion you'd like to see next. Together, we'll keep uncovering how each era stitches another piece of our shared story. A story woven with fabric, memory, and transformation.